behind your back! Stop resisting! Back away right now!
She had already picked out the frame for her diploma. Reagan Tokes was 21 years old, the kind of person who made everyone around her believe the world was good. Born in Edgewood, Kentucky, and raised in Maumee, Ohio, Reagan was the daughter that every parent dreams of raising. She carried a 4.5 grade point average through high school, played varsity lacrosse and tennis, and walked into the Ohio State University with a fire in her eyes that never dimmed. She had wanted to attend OSU since she was a little girl. That dream became real. She originally studied pre-med, then switched to psychology. Not because she gave up, but because she wanted to understand people. She wanted to help and heal. Her plan was precise, passionate, and full of promise. Graduate in May 2017. Move to Cleveland, work at the Cleveland Clinic, then graduate school, then her own psychology practice. Reagan worked at Bodega, a popular restaurant and bar in Columbus's trendy Short North neighborhood. She was saving money, building her life, counting down the days. Just days before February 8th, she posted on social media, excited, glowing, about choosing the perfect frame for the diploma she would never live to hang. Her younger sister, Mackenzie, idolized her. Her parents, Toby and Lisa, had moved to Florida when Reagan started college, trusting their daughter's independence and strength. Reagan stayed behind in Ohio because OSU was her dream, and she was living it. She was so close to everything she had worked for. The night of February 8, 2017, would make sure she never got there. Brian Lee Goldsby was born on January 26, 1988, and from the very beginning, the warning signs were everywhere. He grew up in chaos. He claimed his mother was abusive, that alcohol and drugs surrounded his childhood, that he himself was a victim of rape at a young age. Whether true or not, what is documented is far more disturbing than any claim he made in a courtroom. By the time he was a juvenile, Goldsby was already a predator. According to an Ohio Department of Youth Services assessment, he had raped 5-year-old girls and 6-year-old boys. He was a member of the Crips gang. He was stealing, trespassing, threatening family members with knives, and spiraling into violence at an age when most children were still learning multiplication tables. Then, in November 10th, he struck with terrifying boldness. He crept up behind a woman who was 8 months pregnant as she was getting her 2-year-old son out of her car. He pressed a knife to her throat. He threatened to kill her child. He orally raped her in front of her toddler, forced her to drive him to ATMs, took her money, drove her to her own home, and raped her again. The victim was so terrified she refused to testify, so Goldsby was allowed to plead down, not to rape, not to the full weight of his crimes, but to robbery and attempted rape. He received 2 6-year sentences, run concurrently. Effectively 6 years total, and with time served he walked free in November 2016, just months before Reagan Tokes would cross his path. The system saw this man clearly, and then it looked away. Most people imagine that prison changes people, or at the very least, contains them. Brian Goldsby proved neither was true. During his 6-year sentence, Goldsby accumulated 52 documented infractions behind bars. 52. He possessed contraband. He refused orders. He stole from fellow inmates. He fought. He created disturbances so frequently and so severely that prison officials transferred him between 5 different correctional facilities just to manage him. He was not a man quietly serving his time. He was a man demonstrating, over and over again, exactly what he was. And yet, on November 13, 2016, the gates opened, and Brian Goldsby walked out. He was designated a Tier 3 sex offender, the most serious classification under Ohio law. He was handed a GPS tracking device through a re-entry program called Alvis, but Alvis didn't actively monitor the device. They simply handed it to him and moved on. Because of his violent history, Goldsby couldn't even qualify for Alvis's standard re-entry housing. Instead, he was placed in a temporary housing center run by something called the Exit Program. The Exit Program had one rule for him: be back by 10 p.m. That was it. Staff allowed him to come and go freely throughout the day, accepting his word that he was going to work. The founder later admitted Goldsby had a standing pass to leave during what he claimed were work hours. His parole officer didn't monitor him either. He violated parole multiple times. He let his GPS battery die. He spent nights away from the housing center. Officials classified these violations as non-severe. Meanwhile, in the weeks before February 8th, Brian Goldsby committed 6 separate robberies and was never arrested for a single one. 6 robberies. 0 consequences. Reagan Tokes was walking into a trap the system had spent years constructing. February 8, 2017, started like any other Wednesday. Reagan Tokes went to work at Bodega, the restaurant and bar in Columbus's Short North neighborhood, where she had been building her savings and counting down to graduation. She was a familiar, beloved presence there, the kind of employee who remembered regulars' orders, who smiled through a long shift, who talked about her plans with anyone who would listen. Cleveland was waiting. The Cleveland Clinic was waiting. Her diploma frame was sitting at home, ready to be filled. When her shift ended that night, Reagan walked out into the cold Columbus air alone. Brian Goldsby was nearby. What happened next unfolded with horrifying speed. Goldsby abducted her. He robbed her, he raped her, and then, with a cruelty that goes beyond comprehension, he forced her into her own car and made her drive. Not to safety, not to freedom. He directed her to Scioto Grove, Metro Park, in Grove City, Ohio, a dark and isolated stretch of nature that, in the middle of a February night, was completely deserted. He forced her out of the car. He forced her to remove her clothing, and then he marched her, barefoot and naked in the February cold, into an open field. Just before midnight, Brian Goldsby shot Reagan Tokes twice in the head and left her body in that field like she was nothing, like she had never mattered. Like the diploma frame at home, the plans for Cleveland, the psychology practice she had dreamed of, like none of it had ever existed. Her body was found the following morning by a passerby. Reagan Tokes was 21 years old. Brian Goldsby stood trial in March 2018, and the verdict was never in doubt. The evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but prosecutors weren't satisfied. They argued that a legal error during the trial had prevented them from seeking the death penalty, and they filed a cross-appeal. The legal battle that followed dragged on for years, pulling Reagan's family back into courtrooms again and again when all they wanted was to grieve. In 2019, prosecutors were granted the authority to appeal. Oral arguments were heard before Ohio's 10th District Court of Appeals in July 2020. In September of that year, the appeals court ruled that prosecutors could not continue pursuing the death penalty. The state, under former Franklin County District Attorney Ron O'Brien, appealed that decision to the Ohio Supreme Court, which agreed to take the case. Then, newly elected District Attorney Gary Tyack took office and withdrew the appeal entirely. The death penalty question died with it. Brian Goldsby would live out his days in prison, never facing the ultimate punishment his prosecutors had sought. Meanwhile, the Tokes family filed a civil lawsuit against both the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction and Misery, Inc., the company behind the exit program that had housed Goldsby, with virtually no supervision. They argued, compellingly, that the failure to monitor a known violent predator was negligence that cost their daughter her life. Multiple courts dismissed the claims against the state. The Ohio Supreme Court refused to hear that case. The lawsuit against Nisre was eventually settled quietly, out of court, the details sealed from public view. For Reagan's family, the courtrooms gave them some answers, but not enough. In the aftermath of Reagan Tokes' murder, something remarkable happened. Her parents, Toby and Lisa, did not disappear into their grief, though no one would have blamed them if they had. Instead, they turned their devastation into action, channeling the unbearable weight of losing their daughter into a crusade to make sure no other family would suffer the same fate. They lobbied. They testified. They showed up at the Ohio State House again and again, carrying Reagan's story and refusing to let legislators look away from the failures that had led to her death. In 2018, Governor John Kasich signed part of the Reagan Tokes Act into law. The legislation was designed to strengthen oversight of violent offenders after their release from prison, tightening the loopholes that had allowed a GPS tracker to go unmonitored, that had permitted 6 robberies to go unpunished, that had let a Tier 3 sex offender wander freely through Columbus until he found Reagan. The case was also featured on Dateline NBC, On the Case with Paula Zahn, and Criminal Confessions on the Oxygen Network, bringing Reagan's story to millions of Americans and reigniting national conversations about parole reform, recidivism, and the responsibility the justice system carries for crimes committed by those it releases. The Columbus Dispatch named it one of the top 10 news stories in Central Ohio in 2017. But for those who knew Reagan, who knew about the diploma frame, the Cleveland Clinic plans, the psychology practice she would have opened, it wasn't a news story. It was a life. Reagan Tokes wanted to help people heal. In the end, through the law that bears her name, she still is